Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Oleksandr Uysk takes a decision over Derek Chisora in the UK, 117-112 and 115-113 on 2 cards, remains unbeaten and on track for a title shot. He remains the WBO mandatory. So in this video we'll talk briefly about the action, not so much too detailed round by round, but just the general story of the fight, because Oleksandr Uysk had to come through some hairy moments, but there's some questions coming out of this. We'll get to the fighter statements from the post-fight interview and talk a little bit about the what next. But starting with the action proper, those first couple of rounds, Derek Chisora really came out strong on Oleksandr Uysk like white on rice, pressing forward, making it really tough and difficult, swinging big shots at Oleksandr Uysk, not necessarily landing many. There was one that did catch Uysk and relatively clean, and you could see that Oleksandr Uysk didn't like it, but in general, Oleksandr Uysk was coming under a lot of pressure. There were some tactics being used by Derek Chisora early on and also through the fight. Some shots that were maybe straying a little bit low. He was making it rough and rugged, grabbing Usyk's arm and sort of hitting with the other. And at times, Oleksandr Uysk was looking to the ref, but finding really nothing from the ref. So Chisora just kept doing what the ref was allowing in this fight. And there were a couple of moments there I sort of thought, Usyk's just got to keep going. And if he thinks the shot is low or something's happening, that there's some fouling going on, he's just got to fight through, because otherwise he could get caught with something when he's appealing to the ref. But those first few rounds, it was a case that Derek Chisora looked good, really good. He was making it pretty tough, tricky and awkward, and Uysk didn't like what was coming at him. Round 3, Chisora just buttoned off just a little bit. Uysk starts to come into the fight a bit more, starts to find his timing. The footwork is a little bit better. He's stepping back, avoiding more shots. But round 3, Chisora puts it back on Uysk. And after the first 4 rounds, I did actually have Oleksandr Uysk down 3-1. I have seen some people say that they had Chisora up 3-0 after 3 rounds, including Eddie Hearn, but my card after those 3 was 2-1, and then I gave the 4th to Chisora. Although, it was close, it was maybe a swing round, but it was really rounds 5 to 8 that Oleksandr Uysk really started to come into the fight. I think as many people expected, because the way I sort of predicted this fight may play out was Oleksandr Uysk to weather a few hairy moments early on, start to get into his stride, and start to pick Derek Chisora apart. And that's seemingly what happened between rounds 5 to 8, got into a stride. But then Chisora got a bit of a second win, rounds 8, 9, 10, and made it a little bit tougher and awkward than those earlier sort of rounds 5 to 8. But ultimately by that point, Chisora was sort of fighting in bursts later in the fight. He wasn't actually landing much of note. There were some cuffing shots, stuff landing to, the arms, shoulders, that sort of stuff. The odd shot Uysk didn't like, maybe a little bit low. But ultimately, Uysk, through those later rounds, in my view at least, was actually winning the rounds because he was just landing more shots and more clean, effective work and a greater volume than Derek Chisora, who was struggling at times. He was taking parts of rounds off, but he'd have his moments, but it just, for me, in those later rounds wasn't enough. I know some people have sort of seen the scoring. I mean, Derek Chisora himself, and we'll just get to this, he thought that he won. And heading into the 12th round, Chisora's trainer was saying that Chisora was winning the fight, which on my card, I was like, well, what? What's he actually sort of seeing here? I had it 8-4. I can see an argument, for 7-5 at a stretch, but that's giving every swing round to Derek Chisora. One referee had it 117-112. I had it 116-112. I mean, maybe 7-5 at a push, but I don't think that there was any issue with the scoring here. Derek Chisora did not win that fight. He started strong, but he faded and he didn't do enough. He was following Oleksandr Uysk around the ring. He wasn't able to land enough clean, effective work. And I think this is largely how we thought the fight would play out in terms of Oleksandr Uysk to start to come into his own. Maybe he wasn't as good as some people were expecting, that it wasn't, the most polished performance, but in some respects we have to take into account he's been out of the ring for over a year now. He's only had this is his second fight since the end of 2018. I was expecting to see some sort of degree of ring rust, that, what version of Usyk was going to turn up. He's had injuries, there's inactivity. What would we see in the fight? And I think maybe we did see a degree of that. But on the other side, Chisora's also had an absence from the ring, part of it due to COVID, but he put on a good performance, but it just wasn't enough. And that's largely how I think a lot of people saw it going, that Chisora had a puncher's chance, but if he wasn't able to land early and often and really sort of get some knockdowns, or at least landing something so significant to really put Oleksandr Uysk into a shell or out of the fight, that he wasn't going to get the win. And ultimately, when he did start to tire, it became a much more sort of clinical performance at that point for Oleksandr Uysk. He was able to manage the range better at points, put pressure on, and he was having a much better time rounds 5 to 8. The final few rounds, it was maybe a bit tougher and tricky and awkward, but it was still mostly Usyk for me, at least on the scorecards. Chisora says he's gutted, that he thought he won, but he needs to look at the fight, and he thought that overall Usyk did well. But he did say he didn't actually really get hurt in the fight. There was no painful shots. Although there were some times where he was sort of put back on his heels. One time in particular, I think it was near the end of round 7, where it really looked like he was buzzed by a combination by Usyk. But, it was the footwork, it was the speed, and just in general, the skill gap for Oleksandr Uysk that really gave him this fight. He was able to start winding through the gears a little bit, maybe not as much as we've seen in other fights, especially at cruiserweight, but he was able to do enough to get the win here. And I certainly think the right man did win. I disagree with Chisora and his corner. He did not win this fight, but he put up a valiant effort, but ultimately he fell short. So he advances to, I think it's 32 wins and 10 losses. And, again, as a guy at world level, he's fallen short. I still think he is a guy that's somewhere in or around the top 20. You're going to get an honest fight. It's kind of like Carlos Takam. You're going to, have a tough fight regardless. Although, the other opponent, if they are the A side, probably is going to win the fight. And in this instance, it happened again. So Chisora, he left no stone unturned. They were saying it was the best he's ever come in terms of condition. His stamina was some of the best it's ever been, and it needed to be against Oleksandr Uysk. But ultimately, he lost that fight because Usyk was just too good. It's kind of that simple. But there are some things about the fight that obviously may be a little concerning going forward. Because in those early rounds, you think a guy in Chisora who was effectively the same size as Oleksandr Usyk with a shorter reach. Bigger, better heavyweights in the division. Well, look at those early rounds and think, look, I might be able to ragdoll this guy. Rough him up. Make it, tough and awkward. Make him not like what he's actually receiving. And potentially even hurt and stop him. Because I think this fight, Oleksandr Usyk, he certainly didn't look, unbeatable. I think there will be some guys in the heavyweight division that will look at this and go, actually, I can take this guy. I've got this guy. Especially some of the taller timber in the heavyweight division, guys who are 6'6" and can potentially manage the range over Usyk. Because remembering, he picked Chisora slightly smaller, shorter reach. He was able to do some things because of his natural advantages. In other fights, he may not have that, to actually rely on. He's going to have to take the fight to the bigger, taller opponent. And he may end up walking onto some shots as Derek Chisora walked onto some of Usyk. So, yeah, it's interesting in terms of the what next. But I think this fight, we knew that this was a litmus test. I think this will sort of establish Oleksandr Usyk in at least some people's minds who were doubters. People thought that Chisora was just going to blitz him and take him out. Usyk weathered the storm, came through it, put on a relatively good performance. It wasn't perfect, but Usyk himself said he thought it was a 3 out of 10 performance. And he did expect it to be a tough fight. And he said, look, I've been out of the ring for a year, but he wants to go home, regroup, and obviously on to the next one. But he was a little bit coy when pressed on, would it be Anthony Joshua next, or what was happening next? And that's obviously a question that we have. But another question, the power. He was hurting Chisora at times, but not to the extent where you thought Chisora was going to go down. There was one or two instances towards the end of rounds where if Usyk had maybe had a few more seconds, would have been interesting to see what would have happened. But he doesn't have that one-punch power. That's not new. That's not a revelation. He's an accumulation sort of guy. He uses his skill, will use angles. He steps around he moves around the ring, tires you out, and then really starts to go to work. But against some other guys, is he going to have enough? Especially if he's got some of those physical disadvantages of lesser reach, lesser height, against some of these guys that can maybe jab his head off, frustrate him, not allow him to fight his fight. It's certainly a question heading forward. And are people looking at this fight thinking Usyk beats Joshua, Usyk beats Fury? I'm sure some people are thinking, well, maybe not. I'm not saying that he can't, because I think obviously he is one of the best fighters, pound-for-pound fighters in the world. But obviously he's coming up, he's at some disadvantage, but he is still a class act. And I could see that going forward, maybe some heavyweights will see this fight and go, he's beatable, be more willing to sort of take a fight. Remembering some heavyweights have not really been mentioning his name. They've been saying he's a nobody, he offers nothing, yada, 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 doesn't speak English, there's nothing in fighting him. And to this point, some of that's felt a bit thin. Maybe the performance here, because it wasn't perfect, Chisora was having some success and Usyk wasn't necessarily looking perfect, it could actually get some people in the ring here with Usyk, which I think is what we want to see. We want to see him tested and challenged. But overall, decent performance, wasn't perfect. He's certainly, like other heavyweights, he is beatable. He wasn't caught too often with clean shots, but that is a testament to his defense as well. But obviously Chisora is at a certain level. Other heavyweights may feel more confident about their chances. But what did you make of this? And what do you make of Derek Chisora, his performance? It was a valiant effort, but he came up short. Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.